Welcome everyone, this is Dr. Mercola, and I'm here today with Dr. Bereano, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Washington, has been actively engaged as an activist in helping people understand and really have a phenomenal impact on the public policy so that GMOs really don't impact our health in a way. So Dr. Bereano, welcome, and if you could expand on your experience so our listeners can better understand your expertise, I think that would help put a proper frame on this.
Sure, thanks. My academic area of work is called sort of technology and public policy, and I'm one of the relatively rare academicians who believes in coupling one's civic activities with the area in which you're knowledgeable. And of course, over the past decades, the whole sets of questions about all different types of technologies, not just GMOs, and their impacts on the public and so forth have become matters of general discussion. So over the past 3 decades, though, I've done a lot of work in regard to genetically engineered organisms, foods, crops, animals, etc., etc. Also some work in terms of human genetic engineering issues. And basically, I've done some of that locally, I've done some of it nationally and internationally. I actually have had the great privilege of participating in, under the UN, in the negotiation of 2 international treaties dealing with GMOs, and participating in the UN's agency particular to foods, the Codex Alimentarius, on its committees and task forces dealing with genetically engineered foods. So it's been an incredible set of experiences, and dovetails pretty closely with what I do in a more arid academic sense.
Well, great. I'm glad you can join us today. And we really, the big challenge is because there's many other people in academics who are really pretty vigorously promoting the safety of genetically modified foods and the benefits it is to the culture as a whole, and it's being actively promoted. And I'm wondering if you could share with us your perspective, because it's really wonderful to have the science behind us as to why you feel genetically modified foods may not be safe.
Well, first of all, we need to understand what we mean by the word safe. Actually, in terms of the academic literature, safe refers to an acceptable level of risk. It doesn't refer to situations where there is no risk. Most of us drive in cars all the time and consider it to be safe, even though we know that people are killed and injured in automobiles frequently. So we have to understand that safe equals acceptable risk. The problem with calling genetically engineered organisms safe is that there are no valid risk assessments being done on them. There's no research really being done into the health or environmental effects of genetically engineered organisms. Certainly no work that is published in the peer-reviewed literature, that isn't proprietary. Corporations promoting these things claim that they've done research, but you can't get any information on it because it's all claimed to be proprietary. So under what is known now as the precautionary principle, which is, you know, what your grandparents used to teach you about look before you leap kind of thing, the only prudent course of action is not to proceed with something which has potential risks and only potential benefits until you know a little bit more about it. This approach is enshrined in these international treaties I referred to, most notably the Cartagena Biosafety Protocol, which has about 175 countries as members of it, not including the United States, and says very clearly that countries may use the precautionary approach before allowing in the import of any genetically engineered organisms into their territories. So that would be one way of assuring that one stays safe. The other would be, of course, if the industry or government-sponsored research into both the health and the environmental risks. And They're not doing that for reasons that I could elaborate on. There are very few peer-reviewed studies that have been published on these things. Now, there's quite a bit of research that has indicated that there may be health risks, but this research has not been able to be funded for replication, for extension, for further studies, and so forth. And very often the scientists who have performed that research as sort of independent science on monies that they could scrounge together have become ostracized instead of recognized for maybe opening up an important area of inquiry.
Well, some of these studies that purportedly demonstrate the safety of GMO foods, I know in many of the other areas, such as drugs and food additives, many of these studies have enormous conflict of interest. So they're funded by the very industry that's seeking to sell the solution and produce universally results that are compatible with the sale of their product.
Well, of course, the same kind of thing exists in terms of GMOs and also the revolving door where people from Monsanto routinely are populating the FDA and things like that. But we also have other elements which we can talk about that feed into this. That the benefits are touted, but they're mostly often are potential benefits, and the issue of benefits is benefits to whom. And also, the risks would be risks to whom. There's a distributional aspect, of course. It's not just a question of what the total risks or benefits might be, but who do they accrue to? And that makes it also a more political or a social, if you will, set of issues. Conflicts of interest. That's a crass kind of situation, but it operates very institutionally, too, because a lot of scientists are in departments which get funding from the biotech industry, and what it evolves into is a set of worldviews. If you are immersed in it's a sociological issue actually, in a profession, in a culture, and all of your colleagues think certain ways about certain things, you're not very likely to challenge that. This is true of all different, baseball players think like baseball players, and bankers think like bankers, and this kind of stuff. And by and large, that's true. Of course, there are renegade bankers, and there are, rogue baseball players, I guess. But there are the exact same phenomenon happens with geneticists and people who do biotech science. They read the same journals. They get reviewed for promotion, promotion and tenure and academic things. I think this is nothing startling. It tends to make people conservative. You have to parrot the same views that your older superiors believe, or otherwise they're going to think you're crazy and not doing good work and won't promote you. So there are social mechanisms which reinforce this that go well beyond the crassness of conflict of interest, or in a very simplified sense,
Well, still a profoundly important component, because Monsanto has very cleverly been able to infiltrate almost every aspect of the federal regulatory agencies in the United States. From Clarence Thomas, who's a former chief counsel for Monsanto, who is now one of the Supreme Court Chief Justices, to the head of the United States Department of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, and I think the deputy chief of the FDA. They're just, and there's a half a dozen others who are just really are absolutely in control of every regulatory decision that's made on these things. So, most of our listeners have the firm belief that Monsanto is one of the most evil companies on the planet.
Oh, well, there are lots of evil corporations on the planet. I don't think we need to rank them and everything. The problem is that there's no social accountability, and that's because the U.S. doesn't have regulatory oversight over genetically engineered products. Now, part of this is due to this revolving door, as we call it, but a lot of it goes before that, because the U.S. is one of the only countries in the world that claims to have a regulatory system, but in fact never had a specific statute designed to set up such a regulatory system. And that was a decision, and these policies are true in both Democratic and Republican administrations. Under the first President Bush in 1992, it goes a little bit earlier than that, in 1986, the Fed said they would, quote, regulate genetic engineering under existing statutes. So, for example, EPA had legislation that allowed it to regulate pesticides. So, there's a kind of legal fiction to cram the existing GMOs that are developed into the pigeonholes that the earlier regulatory statutes had, which had no reference at all to GMOs because they were well before the development of this technology. So there was a public policy decision made not to go for special regulation, which would have, of course, resulted in lots of news articles, congressional hearings, and all the rest of it, which would have alerted the public in this country to the existence of this new technology, which huge numbers of Americans have no idea exists or is in their food supply, unlike other countries where these have all been matters of public debate. And that was a very shrewd decision by the government and by the industry, and claiming first in 1986 that this coordinated federal framework of existing regulatory bodies could handle it, and then in 1992 officially claiming that genetically engineered foods were, quote, substantially equivalent to their non-engineered counterparts. This was a policy of the FDA, which, one, was announced not by the FDA, but by the President's Council on Competitiveness, which was composed all of corporate executives, the chair of whom was at the time Vice President Dan Quayle, who actually made this announcement in June of 1992. And secondly, we now know, we found out subsequently, that this policy was vigorously objected to by most FDA scientists because there was a lawsuit a number of years later, and in the discovery process, concerned citizens got access to a lot of FDA documents at which scientists said, this is nonsense, of course there's a difference. And the third thing is that the same corporations that have argued that in terms of regulation that there's no difference between GMOs and non-GMOs, then walk across the street to the patent office and argue that GMOs are totally novel and totally different and totally unique and therefore should get a patent monopoly. So a lot of this is going on, has nothing to do with the evilness of Monsanto per se. I mean, that's a nice kind of stock character and motivates a lot of people. But we have to understand we're dealing with a much more profound institution